Dr. Hindman, we are so excited to have you with us today and looking forward to your opening comments on our topic, the veto and the Constitution. So we're going to ask that you just give some opening comments and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. I'm just delighted to be here. I think one of the things that strikes me in this sort of renaissance we're having in the country and constituting America has kind of been at the vanguard of that in making sure we take civic education seriously. And so I'm delighted to be here and really grateful for the chance to talk with you guys. I think so. I'm talking about the veto with you all. And the thing that I want to think about a little bit is I kind of want to unpack some of the parts of the veto that we might not immediately think of. And I think one of the things we commonly think of the veto power as a presidential power, but it's rooted in Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, right? In the presentment clause. And so it's deeply embedded in the legislative process. And when you stand back from this clause, I think you see James Madison's fingerprints all over this provision because it gets to the core of the separation of powers. When we think of what the separation of powers means for the Constitution, this is what really gives it teeth, I think. Congress essentially has to submit its work to the president for approval or disapproval. And that provides, I think, the basic functional check on factionalism and legislative overreach, of which the framers, as you all know, are very concerned about. For Congress to do anything, it has to present every bill, every order, every vote to the president for his approval. And the president can do four things, essentially. The president can sign the bill, and it becomes a law. The president can veto the bill and must return it with the reasons for the veto. Or there's an odd provision called the pocket veto, which allows the president to wait 10 days. And if Congress goes out of session in those 10 days, the bill doesn't become a law. But if Congress stays in session for those 10 days, the bill will ultimately become a law. And that is a very careful balancing that the framers wanted to strike between having a president that could say no to bills outright. It could be an absolute veto, as the British king had, and they didn't want that. They didn't want one person to stand in the way of Congress's authorities. But they also wanted to provide a real check, a real stopping mechanism against bad legislation. And so that balance is struck with what we call a qualified veto. As you know, the president can veto a bill, but then Congress, if both houses of Congress agree to a two-thirds supermajority, that provision can be overridden. So it's this moderate position that I think is really kind of interesting. Um, Politically, one of the things that I think we might want to touch on a little bit is this ties back to the Declaration of Independence. In one of the middle lines of the Declaration of Independence, there's a grievance against the king that says, he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Under the British system, every law that was passed by Parliament and colonial legislatures to take effect needed to have the affirmative assent of the king. And in America, we wanted to make sure that democracy still existed in some way over the objections of a monarch. And so what we decided to do was give this qualified veto, and it's rooted in our Declaration experience. The second thing that I think is pretty interesting to think about is that the veto comes into play after and only after Congress completes most of the legislative work. Um, and this is really at the core of the separation of powers, right? You want the branches to deliberate among themselves. The president is constituted differently than the legislature, and that interaction brings different ideas and different interests into the government by forcing everybody to be on the same page and with this supermajority requirement to override a presidential veto. The laws that exist here, are relatively well thought, hopefully, right? You have the opportunity to build a consensus. Presidents, if they think bills and would be against the public interest, let's say it narrowly passes by 51%, a president flies in and says, I'm going to veto this. They block it to make sure that Congress can go back and do its work better. And that is a really core provision, right? It's not merely obstruction for obstruction's sake, but it's obstruction to make the law better. And I think that's an understated or some kind of overlooked provision of the veto that we don't often think about. And so it's worth kind of just having those pieces in the back of your mind. At the Constitutional Convention, the veto, because it touches all sorts of aspects of the separation of powers, it was part of the conversation kind of on a couple different days. It was introduced, a version of it was introduced with the very first draft, right, in the Virginia plan with Edmund Randolph, in the form of a council of revision. They wanted to have a president and some executive officials. They weren't quite sure whether we would have a multi-headed president or a singular president, and judges would be mixed together. And so they debated this council of revision, and ultimately they rejected it in favor of a strong central presidency, a strong single-headed presidency, to counteract the democratic excesses of Congress. On June 4th, they had major debate in 1787 on the veto, and they debated it both in the context of the executive branch and in how it would relate to Congress. So what was the ability of Congress to overcome presidential opposition? Um, they resumed it later, June 7 or July 17th, 1787, and they actually locked in the single qualified veto with a president and the two-thirds majority override requirement. Um, and some of the anti-federalist voices, Elbridge Gerry, George Mason, some of the other ones that were around, they kind of opposed it a little bit and tried to reinvigorate debate on it. But on August 15th, 1787, near the end of the convention, their objections were sort of ignored by the rest of the convention. So we were left with this single executive with a two-thirds majority override. So standing back from the convention, put the convention kind of on a platform here. Let's talk a little bit about the ways these vetoes have been employed historically. Federalist 73 is a great resource if you're looking to read more about this. Hamilton really talks about the political effects. And he says there's two purposes that the veto serves. And when we look back at the convention debates, both of these things are present in various forms in the convention debates. He said the first reason you would use a veto is to defend the executive office, right? You want to preserve checks and balances. You want to prevent legislative encroachment against the president. So you use the veto as a constitutional fortification, a weapon against intrusions by the executive on presidential power. And then Hamilton comes around and says it actually serves a second purpose, though, and that purpose is to make Congress more reflective about public policy. I touched on that at the beginning. You want them to increase the chances of building good community around the law, building good consensus. And the veto, he says, would, quote, increase the chances in favor of the community against the passing of bad laws through haste, inadvertence, or design. By compelling Congress to lean in on those things and do it over again, it would make the law better. Okay. And when we stand back from this, we kind of see the law, see the veto provision in its full effect. It's not only to defend the presidency, but it's also to help check faction and make our legislation stronger. And Hamilton says one more interesting thing that I want to call attention to. He says the presence of opposition, the idea that a president could say no, has a preemptive power to make sure Congress tries to avoid his disapproval. So what will happen is Congress will say, well, the president's going to veto this bill if we put this provision in. So we're not going to do that. And that sort of salutary effect, we don't use the veto as much as we might want to because of that latent power that kind of operates under the surface where members are afraid of those things and act to avoid the veto. One last thing I'll just touch on very quickly. The number of veto overrides is relatively small. When we look in total, it's roughly about 7% of all vetoes, and we're talking in the neighborhood of about 2,000 vetoes in American history. Roughly 7% of those vetoes have been overridden. Almost every president, with the exception of President Biden, has had a veto overridden during their term. And there's various ways we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, about the way those veto overrides tend to work a little bit. But let me just stop and I'll leave it here a little bit because I want to get to your questions too. The Constitution is not, my biggest takeaway, if you get nothing else, is that the Constitution establishes a veto for good public policy. It's not anti-democratic obstructionism, although it kind of looks that way sometimes. But where you sit on a policy often determines your judgment about whether you like a veto or not. You can find vetoes you love, you can find vetoes you hate, and that's a huge part of this story, I think. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview. And
Thank
I
you.
loved how you pointed out that it's rooted in the Declaration of Independence and love the explanation that you gave from Federalist 73. So thank you. We're so excited to
Sure.
have you today, and I'm going to turn it over to Janine.
Okie doke. Yes, thank you, Professor Hindman. That was enlightening, and I have some questions, but only 2% battery on the notes I did on my phone. So I hope I was looking for a pen, but I feel like I was in the Apple store where no one's ever heard of a pen. Go to the
It's
Apple
okay.
store and ask for a pen. They're like, "What's that?" Um, okay. So, really interesting. Where to begin? I think okay, I'm just gonna go with my last question first. It's interesting as an actress because I'm an actress.
Sure.
y- You always want to present the take where in front of the camera where you're acting
Yeah.
in a organic sense where you're not worried about the director in the head, the director, like the editors. A lot of actors will work like, I'm gonna try to work this my close up because I know how the director's gonna cut it and I know what they're gonna like or they're not gonna like. And in that process, that actor is losing all sense of genuineness and all sense of creativity because they're in their head. And my acting coach used to say, get the director out of your head, just be organically in your choices. So when you said that the veto automatically makes Congress start thinking about what the president's going to like and not like, so they won't get a veto. In a way, that seems to me that it might impede their creativity and their originality and the thought process about because they're so worried. It's sort of like curtailing their their gifts of legislation
No, I
to think
definitely
that
think
way,
that's fair.
to be
Yeah.
worried about the veto. In other words, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's one of those interesting moments where you have this, if you have a president that you would know would be sort of instigant, right, and not let a lot of things through, and that's happened in both parties, right, where members of Congress might be hesitant to send up things that are, maybe in the public good, but they know they can't get it around the president. And that I think encourages that hurly-burly kind of fighting that happens. But you're right. I think it does
Hmm.
undermine some
A little
elements of
bit,
maybe
just a
legislative innovation.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, think of when they wrote the Declaration of Independence or when they wrote the United States Constitution. I mean, they did have to think about ratification with the Constitution, but they didn't have to worry about pleasing the king, you know?
Right.
And when they
Right.
wrote the Declaration of Independence, it was against the king, so they could be as creative as they wanted. Think about how they may have altered it if they had tried to please the person that was, they did have to worry about that a little bit with the states and the ratification of the Constitution, but we might not have the brilliance that we have in those two documents.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting too, the closed nature of the convention. Remember, they locked everybody in Independence Hall in
Mhm,
Philadelphia, and they didn't let them talk outside of that. And I think there's something to
mhm.
be said for the idea that you have something that's kind of done in secrecy, but for a democratic purpose. And this presence of the veto maybe pulls us away from maybe our constitutional Philadelphia heritage in that sense. I don't know. Yeah.
A little bit. And I think today everyone's grandstanding for social media all the time that they may not be genuinely legislating the way they might want to be. But we're really focused on these checks and balances. And I love the veto check. There was, and how brilliant that was. Now, one of my first questions before I lose all battery on my phone, where are you getting, because all of our students might be interested in learning this, where all those facts about which uh representative in the Constitutional Congress, so to speak,
Sure.
what book is that? Where are you getting those
Yeah. So this
references?
is, I don't know if this works, but well, I can
Look
send
at
it
this,
to you guys
Kathy.
too. This is James Madison's notes on the Federal Convention. So these
Is
are,
that where he talks about who did what? That should be in our
yeah.
book club next.
So it's very good there. So
That's
that's the
really
abridged one. That's
interesting.
really good in terms of giving the votes and how it went down. I think it's
Right,
excellent.
Tova? Tova, that would be awesome to have that next in our book club since she's the head of the book club.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
um,
And then there's a longer
yeah,
one too,
notes.
if you want the
Mhm.
full thing. I mean, there's a 2 volume set that's the Max Farron, which is literally a lot more. But this is Madison's notes, and I think that's an excellent place to. to go
Madison's
from.
notes. Okay, really
Yeah.
fascinating. You talked about 4 ways to veto. Could you go over
Yes.
that just a little one more time for our students?
100%. Sure. So when a president gets a bill, right, it has to pass both houses in identical form, right? It has to pass both
That's
the
another
House and the
check.
Senate.
Yeah.
Huge,
Mhm.
huge bicameralism. And then it gets presented to the president, and he or she's got four options. They can sign it or they can veto it. And then if so that's the basic way, right? That's a regular
That's
veto.
number
That's
1
the
and number 2.
number
Number
one
1
and
and
number
number 2, are
two.
you saying that's
Yeah, number
okay.
one is
Mhm.
sign it. Number two is veto it outright. And then they have to write a
Mhm.
note that says why they vetoed it and return that
Mhm.
to Congress. So there's that
Mhm.
deliberation happening again, right? And then the other two options are kind of strange. And it was meant to prevent the like last minute cramming, like when you're cramming for a test or something like that. When Congress waits till the last minute to try and pass a bunch of stuff before they go out of session, the Constitution says, well, you know what? If you rushed it at the end of the session, we're going to do 10 days. And if the president gets it in the last 10 days and Congress stays in session for those 10 days, it automatically becomes law. He doesn't have to do anything to it, right? If he doesn't sign it, he doesn't veto it.
Explain that again.
Sure,
Explain that
yeah.
again.
So,
Okay.
so the third option, there's this provision. It's in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 3, near the end. And the
I
essential
have it
argument
right
is
here.
that if
Mhm.
excellent, if Congress um, stays in set, if they send a president a bill and the president doesn't want to sign it, doesn't want to veto it, and they stay in session for 10 days, after that 10-day point, the bill automatically becomes a law, whether the president,
So the president could just do nothing. So
absolutely
the first
nothing.
option is veto, the first
Yep,
option is accept, the third
right.
option is to do nothing.
Literally do nothing. And if
And then he or
Congress,
she doesn't have to make their political statement on it.
100%. And this goes back to the declaration you mentioned before, Janine. The president, even inactivity, doesn't stop the democratic process. So the inactivity of a president, let's say you just have a president that's kind of lazy or doesn't want to do anything with it, it'll go into law after those 10 days, provided Congress stays in
Fascinating.
Washington. And that ties
Fascinating.
back to the declaration, which I think is the coolest part
Which
of
we'll
this.
go find that in 2 seconds. Okay, and so what's
Yeah.
the fourth?
And then the fourth one is if Congress bails out of town during that 10-day period and the president does nothing, but Congress leaves town, the bill dies. And that's a pocket, what we call a
Mm.
pocket veto. He just puts it, essentially just puts it in his pocket, right? And that part of it is a lot. That's like 50% of all historic vetoes. Like all of our historic vetoes, it's roughly 50-50 in terms of regular vetoes. It's about 1,000 and change. And pocket vetoes are about 1,000 and change vetoes. And so those are the four options. But it's a unique thing that allows sort of the democratic process to continue unless it's at the last minute.
Why would anybody okay, so if a majority passes the bill and they
Yep.
send it to the president and they go out of session and they know if they do that, the president it'll just die. Why would they want to do that? If you have enough people to pass the bill to get it to the presidency, who would want to forfeit it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like, why would you walk away? That would drive me crazy too. And like a lot of times
Okay.
when we watch Congress now, they'll save the worst bill, like the hardest bills to the end of the session or the late period. Today, it's a little different because they do what they call, I mean, this is kind of down in the weeds, but they stay in session for so long it's kind of
Mhm.
squeezed out the possibility that that might happen. They keep these pro forma sessions where they'll come in, they'll say the pledge, do a couple other things, and leave. So they can say that they've stayed in session. And it kind of cuts into that pocket veto power. But maybe 50, 60, 100 years ago, when they would end their sessions relatively early, that last minute thing would become a big deal. So if you waited on a really controversial piece of legislation till midnight the night before you're going out of session, that would give a lot of power to the president to be able to block kind of last minute
Yeah, it
rush
seems like
stuff.
that wouldn't be done today. It seems like if you get a bill to the presidency, there wouldn't be really any impetus to leave and let him do
Right.
that,
Yeah, and I think that's kind of
right?
what we see now with the way the Senate extends its term. Like they avoid recess appointments, another element of the constitutional story, right? They avoid it by making sure they rarely go out of session. It's almost like right up to the end of the next Congress, like right before the next Congress comes into office. So it's really kind of constrained in that. It's a
Yeah, because
constitutional
if they
provision that's
stay
kind of
there,
fallen out.
if
Yeah,
they stay there, the legislature for 10 days and the president does nothing, it automatically becomes a bill. So you would think that's what they would do more often. Okay. Well, I
why
only have a
wouldn't
few
you?
more
Yeah, no,
seconds
it's good.
left.
Sure,
Yeah, a lot of okay, okay, one last quick thing. Quick, because
sure.
you know, other people want to talk. Um, it's interesting to me. Congress, House, Senate go back and forth. They finally pass a bill. They send it to the president. He can veto it. They can send it back. They can override that veto with 2/3 um,
Right.
of the vote of the legislature, right? But they can also rework the bill. And if they rework the bill, they're sending it back to the president and he then may not veto it. So that's what you were sort of talking about, the art of the deal, so to speak, to go back and restructure.
It's a great way of putting it. Yeah, it's that deliberative thing that happens. And that's the goal.
Um,
Like, that's what the framers wanted. They wanted the president and Congress to be, maybe not everybody agrees, but you want a pretty good majority to agree.
Fabulous,
Yeah,
fabulous checks and balances. I mean,
it's
I
really
think it's
beautiful.
overlooked. It's overlooked. We talk a lot about the Bill of Rights and things of that
Sure.
nature, but I think the checks and balances of the Constitution, Scalia thought that as well, are really where they were brilliant at that. I want to read that notes
Yes.
by James Madison, the people that stood up and made these decisions, because to send it back and say, I veto it, then they rework it. That's just a wonderful, but it's already been checked in the House. The Senate checked the House checked the Senate. Now they send it back, and now he sends it back. It's deliberative,
Right.
but that's why I think our republic has lasted. Why so many others have failed. Okay, I'm going to pass. Thank you,
Thank you,
Professor
Janine.
Hinman.
Appreciate
Terrific.
it.
Thank you.
So
Is it you, Wyatt?
Wyatt, let's go with you because it's your last hurrah here.
Alrighty. Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Professor Hinman, for being on today. As Janine was saying too, I mean, just the brilliance of this. It's so interesting. I mean, obviously we all know the veto, but there's just so many checks and balances within it. How that House and Senate, they pass it, and then the president can veto it. But that veto that acts as a check already can have a check on it. It's just really fascinating, and
Really
I
neat.
definitely think that not a lot of people, or not as many people, give the founders credit for that. I
That's
wanted
right.
to ask, how has the use of presidential vetoes changed over the years, and maybe some of the reasonings behind it, especially in the time of now of, strong partisanship and political polarization?
Yeah, no, Wyatt, your students are going to be in great shape, by the way. Congratulations. This is huge for you, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you.
No, I think you're right. I think this is one of those things where it's evolved. And one of the things we need to think about, and this is kind of going back a little bit to some of the things Janine mentioned, right? We got to get Congress back in the game and off the social media and off of the partisan kind of loyalty. The Constitution is designed for members of Congress to be loyal to their institutions. And so as we get these circumstances where we have divided, what we call divided government, where you have a president of one party and Congress controlled by the opposite party, or unified government like we have today, the idea of party being so much of a defining characteristic, I think you're dead right. It makes it difficult to see these checks and balances in operation because primarily partisans are loyal to their party before they're institutionalists, right? They're before they're attached to their presidency. I want to be a good president. I want to be a good senator, and that demands me to maybe put party second to my office. I think that's been an evolution. The interesting thing to your other question, like over time, what we've seen is the frequency of vetoes has gone up, but the frequency of constitutional vetoes is less. It's now become a policy, much more of that second prong of Hamilton's argument. And that in divided government, where there's two parties, one party controlling one branch and the other, that's been a big deal. Yeah, no, that's definitely caused a lot of shifts. It's just another weapon that the parties use against each other, which for constitutionalists like us, it's kind of frustrating a little bit. Like, come on, man. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And when did that shift start happening? Were there certain presidents that began to, instead of looking at I think this might go against the Constitution, to, well, I just don't agree with this policy. When did that start to take place?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really interesting to me because and this was a little bit of stuff I worked on with Gerald Ford, right? That line gets really blurred, right? Presidents presidents claim constitutionalism for their policy outcomes that they want. Really, the first one that was very controversial was during the Andrew Jackson veto of the bank. Now, at one level, you say, well, there's a contested constitutional question underneath it. And at another level, you say, well, maybe he just didn't like the bank, right? And so both of those things are in play constantly. But the idea that a president articulates the Constitution as the reason why they're doing it, with some exceptions, George W. Bush being an exception in recent years, he very much around the Iraq War conflict would claim constitutional powers against the policy argument. But you're right, they're always, like super interwoven in a way, Wyatt. Yeah. I don't know if that helped. I don't know if that got to what you're asking, but
No,
yeah,
no, it's very interesting too. And then you
yeah,
were talking about, yeah, especially with Andrew Jackson, you start seeing it. That's just really interesting to see
just as a
how
rise. Yeah, it's almost
exactly.
logarithmic at that point in a
Hmm.
way. Yeah,
But I mean, as you mentioned too, it is very blurred because obviously a lot of presidents are just going to say, I don't like this. I mean, they're going to try to back it up with some actual
right,
reasoning.
right.
So you're
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely correct there. My next question was, why was it so important for the founders to establish a supermajority in each chamber needed to override the presidential veto? Why couldn't it have been a simple majority? What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, and this was kind of what they talked about at the convention a lot, right? This was kind of a huge deal to them. How much should it be, right? Because obviously at one level you have I thought we were a democracy. I thought we had majority rule. And then you're effectively giving the president 1/3 of the legislative power, right? You're saying that he has one individual exercises essentially an equivalent authority to 1/3 of the legislature. That's pretty significant. The big goal, I think, at the end of the day, is on anything that was just about 51% majority, like just a bare majority. I think the framers were always sensitive of really like narrowly tailored legislation. They didn't want it to just serve some people without there being a broad consensus. So if the president doesn't think it's in the national interest, we want to make sure that more people are on board with it. And that I think at the end of the day was really decisive for why they put it as the supermajority. It's interesting, like when you go to constitutional amendments, when you go to impeachment, those they play with those supermajorities because they really want it to be the people as a whole speaking, right?
Yeah, and thank you. And so my
Sure.
next question was talking about the veto specifically, with the line item veto. So I
Yeah,
was going to ask about this because this was decided by the Supreme Court. I was just going to wonder if you could explain what it was and
sure.
if past presidents before President Clinton had used it and how the Supreme Court changed it.
Yeah, it's very common. It's very common in some state legislatures to be able to move through and alter different governors have this power when it comes to states. And the federal government, they tried to give it in the 90s. They passed the Line Item Veto Act. There was a lot of Supreme Court litigation around it in a way. And the big goal was to it was mainly for the budget. I think the history of Congress has always been Congress wants somebody to restrain their power of the purse when they try to be profligate spenders, right? And the line item veto was given to the presidency in the 90s to be able to encourage presidents to be able to veto specific provisions. There's a huge question. The Supreme Court said effectively, though, that gives too much power to the president to alter specific authorizations, essentially changing the legislation unilaterally after the president had sort of approved it. Like by line iteming some things out and signing it, the president gets the best of both worlds. They can take stuff out of legislation without giving Congress the opportunity to really lean in and fix it. And so that was why the Supreme Court was a little bit hesitant. But as we look at, deficit spending, and there's a lot of people who are very concerned about that in the country, right? It might be helpful to have that at one level. Maybe with retrospect, maybe we should have had it. I don't know. People can come to their own conclusions on that, but that presentment, the ability to change, like some governors were changing individual zeros, like zero, like changing the amount of money on appropriations and stuff. And I think Justice Stevens on the Supreme Court looked at it. He was like, this doesn't work for us. Um,
Yeah, that's
It's
crazy
kind
that
of
they were
icky. It
going
makes you
that
feel
specific.
icky.
Yeah, I mean, whenever
Yeah.
you think of line item, might be a certain policy, but to change the actual zeros on it, that's very
A little
interesting.
weird.
Plus, I didn't know too that you said that it was an act passed by Congress that granted the president this authority to.
Yeah, it was a statutory authorization, which raises all sorts of questions. Now, if we, as a collective society, said, "Hey, we want a constitutional amendment. Hey, this thing works in this half a dozen states. We think our president should have it." If we passed it as a constitutional amendment, I think that changes the game completely, right? I mean, you would be able to have it at that point, but it's a little bit challenging, right?
Absolutely. I just find it really interesting
It's
that
cool.
Congress gave the president even more power, and then the Supreme Court said, "Guys, what are you doing?"
Yeah,
No,
no
that's
bueno. Yeah,
it's so interesting. And
yeah,
then I'm running out of time, so this will
sure.
probably be my final question. But do you believe that the veto and specifically the threat of the veto has grown too much, has made too much impact on legislation, maybe more than what the founders had intended?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And that's the kind of question I like to ask all the time, right? Where we are in terms of our development and the way we wield the power, is it consistent or inconsistent with the way it was others? I don't know. I mean, I think the presence of a veto threat, um, because it's preemptive before Congress finally passes the bill, I actually think it's a really powerful tool to be able to encourage Congress to behave well, right?
Hmm.
Or to avoid the pitchforks and torches mob mentality that sometimes Congress gets into. So I think, the threat might be good, but it also, I think to Janine's point, maybe in those circumstances, it might inhibit otherwise decent legislation if you have presidents that oh, there's no way 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is going to approve this. So
Yeah,
I
kind of
don't
like
know.
a
It's a good question.
double-edged sword. I mean,
Yeah. But this is the kind of cool thing about being in this civic education space, because encouraging that kind of critical thinking about the Constitution, I think, is more of what we need to 100% be doing. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor Hinman, for those amazing answers, and I will pass it on to Tova.
Wyatt, there needs to be like fireworks for you now, because this is a nice
Oh,
drum roll on the way out.
I
Your
know my
students are
last
very lucky.
question. Hard to believe. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor for sure.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Wyatt, for passing on to me. And again, congratulations on finishing up your time on constitutional chats. And I know I and all the audience, if they could express it, are wishing you the best as you take these skills on and bring it to the students you teach. So, Professor, thank you so much for being on. I really enjoyed the session. You packed so much information to such a short amount of time. So
Sure.
let's get right into it.
Okay.
So it was very striking to me that, only 7% of presidential vetoes are overridden. So I was curious with such a small amount of vetoes that are overridden, how
Yeah.
do presidents sort through which bills to veto and which to allow through? What's to prevent presidents from simply vetoing all bills that they don't like, or as Wyatt highlighted, bills just from the other political party as a measure to block bills from going through if, Congress is of a different political party than the president.
Sure.
And so how do presidents weigh when to issue a veto versus using other tools of policy like negotiating behind the scenes?
Sure. I think the prominence of a veto, right, and the way it's covered in the media makes presidents kind of hesitant sometimes unless they're really sure that the public's on their side. I think it makes them very hesitant. So that's a huge part of there's a whole office in the White House that is the Legislative Affairs Office that engages in this constant dialogue about, hey, if you put this provision in, we're not on with it. I think that's kind of an interesting part of it. There's a real hurly-burly between the branches, right? That fight this out, and I think that part of it is a really you touched on it, right? When do they weigh in to say we're going to do it, and when do they hold back? And I don't know. It's kind of unique. I think the idea that they have such a success rate at sustaining vetoes really reaffirms kind of we are a presidential system in an odd way. Like the president has immense policy power, and the veto has always kind of been there. So you're right to raise questions about, hey, maybe they're just doing it for fickle reasons in a way.
And have different presidents made this choice, this calculus differently? Like are some presidents throughout history known to be sort of trigger heavy with
Yeah.
regards to vetoes, and others are much more worried about public perception and haven't employed it as much as a tool?
Yeah, 100%. So just to give you an idea, there's presidents with the most vetoes just historically. FDR vetoed 635. Now he was there for 12 years, right? So it was a long term. But he vetoed 635 bills. Grover Cleveland, a two-term guy, vetoed 584. And Harry Truman did 250. And then there's some presidents that have zero vetoes. John Adams didn't veto anything, James Garfield, Thomas Jefferson. So some of these guys didn't veto at all. And so it's this kind of unique balance where presidents lean in, and the divided government thing's a part of that, and kind of the questions the country's facing, I think, are a big part of that story. Some of them are Whig presidents, so they view the presidency as a mere clerk of, they just follow what Congress says. That's part of that story. But I think there's a value. FDR notoriously would ask his staffers, find me something to veto, right? Find me something to veto to show that I'm still present. And I think presidents have that constant calculus in their minds about when they lean in and when they don't.
That's really fascinating that there's such a standard deviation, such a difference in presidents that you really employ the veto and some that haven't at all. I didn't know that. So I guess on that note, did the presidents who used vetoes hundreds and hundreds of times, did that have them face a negative political effect, as you speculated that that might be something restraining the use of a presidential veto, the potential political backlash? Did you see that in practice for presidents who had that?
Yeah, I think there's some of that story, right? The presidents that use it when they use it for budgetary reasons. So I know Gerald Ford did that a little bit. So Ford leaned in heavy. He's like the fifth or sixth most, like when you take the number of days of presidents and the amount of vetoes they exercise, he's up there pretty high. And he took a lot of heat for it. And what's interesting is Fed 73 was found in the presidential papers of the Ford Library. So Ford's staffers read Fed 73 and took the arguments from Federalist 73 and brought it to the president because he was getting hammered. They called him President No in the media and like this obstructionist king. And he was like, no, listen, my job is to make laws better, not to oppose them. And that's kind of part of that calculus that you said, which I think is kind of cool.
That's really interesting, and for the benefit of our audience, you wrote a book on Gerald Ford and the separation of powers. So you're very qualified to talk about him. That's interesting that he had the Federalist paper, so we can kind of see him, or at least his staffers, thinking on this. I'm curious, do you, as a scholar of Gerald Ford, agree with his arguments on his own use of the veto power, or do you push back on that as a historian?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting. I think one of the things so Ford came into office. Remember, like Ford came into office, it was the Watergate era, right? And then Ford comes into office and then pardons Richard Nixon a month into his term. That November, they get hammered in the midterm elections. And so they have veto-proof majorities in both houses of Congress. And yet Ford sustains a lot of his vetoes. So in a way, the veto becomes the power of persuasion, right? There's this Richard Neustadt argument in the presidency literature in American politics that says presidential power is kind of the Constitution's secondary, but the power to persuade is where power is. And my argument in the book is that the Constitution is the way he gets access to be persuasive. And so the presence of his use of the veto makes Congress have to say, you know what, Gerald Ford kind of has it okay, right? Hey, he might be onto something. We should think about what he's doing. And I think that's that part of it. So I think I'm generally pro presidents asserting their authorities because remember, Congress has all the power too, right? They can muster a two-thirds majority. They can remove presidents that they think are too instigant, right? They can adapt. And so I'm generally a fan, but I'm kind of a biased guy. I know what he fed his dog too, so it's kind of an odd thing, but
You get all the information.
weird details. Yeah. Yeah.
But what's your favorite fun fact about Gerald Ford for the audience that we might not know?
Yeah. No, that's great. He's the guy. There's certain presidents we get that are flashy, like very flashy in terms of their presentation and their media savvy and their media presence. Gerald Ford strikes me as a guy. he struck me as a guy who you would invite over for like making hot dogs in the backyard or something like that. You know what I mean? Like cooking, grilling or something like that. He was an ordinary guy. And I think that's an understated part of our Constitution. What is it about our Constitution that can take, the least, like he wasn't elected, he was never nationally elected. He had veto-proof majorities in both houses of Congress, but the Constitution still gave him the powers and the prestige and the position to be a decent president. Not a stellar, rock star top five, but okay at the end of the day. And I think that's a part of our Constitution that people don't think about. So Gerald Ford's significance, back to my fun fact, is that he was a constitutionalist first and figured out a way to make constitutional arguments for his moment in a way. But the one he would stand in line after he left the White House. He would stand in line at In-N-Out Burger, which is a big California chain burger, and people didn't recognize him as he was standing in line. His Secret Service details. So it's this kind of everyman kind of quality, and it was cool.
That's really interesting. I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah.
And I'm sure as a constitutional scholar yourself, that you probably feel an affinity to the fact that he was a constitutionalist
Oh, I
before
love it. Yeah, I
running off.
love it.
That's great. As a government student, I feel the same.
You
I'm a fan
feel
of
it.
that
Yeah, you know
background.
it. For
So
sure.
finally, with my last minute, I wanted to ask if, we've talked about how vetoes can be controversial sometimes. So what have been throughout American history some of the most, either the most famous or the most controversial uses of a presidential veto?
Yeah, no, there's a couple. I think the one that in recent years, vetoes are always sort of unique in that, you have a Congress that passes a majority, right? You have a majority, and presidents come in and say it is kind of anti-democratic in that sense. There's a couple controversial ones. So the War Powers Resolution in 1973 was overridden. So Congress actually mustered two-thirds majority to override the War Powers Resolution. Nixon, at the same time he was dealing with Watergate, vetoed that bill on very constitutional grounds, and the whole conflagration of stuff kind of prevented him from being able to sustain that veto. In 1986, President Reagan vetoed a comprehensive anti-apartheid act in 1986, and that was overridden as well. President Obama recently had a veto override when he vetoed a bill that would have made Saudi Arabia liable for their tangential connections in 9/11. And then Donald Trump had one as well in 2021 was our last one that he was overridden on an NDA, like the National Defense Authorization Act, because of US involvement in Yemen. So these things still come up. And this is the thing I think is really important about the Constitution. It's like the frame of your house. It's always kind of there, right? And if you don't always see it all the time, but it's kind of always there. I'm taking up too much time though, so I'll suspend. But Tova, great questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'll now pass on to Kathy.
Yeah, thank you guys.
And I love your frame of the house analogy. That's perfect.
Yeah.
So, Professor Hinman, we have a lot of audience questions, but first we're going to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV in Las Vegas airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you, Las Vegas, for listening to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We also want to take a minute and recognize our teachers who are watching today. And we have got Tom Longbotham, who is a Texas high school teacher. We have D'Angela Hines watching with students at Emerald Coast Christian Academy. And we have Andrew Christovich watching with Stanton College Prep. So if you are a teacher or a teacher with students, or if you're a student and wants to shout out, drop your name in our Q&A and we'll give you a shout out before the end of the program. So we'll start with Andrew K., who is correcting me on my pronunciation of your town. Andrew says it's Worcester, Mass.
Yeah, Worcester. It's weird. It's a weird. I've had to learn a whole lexicon up here, so it's good.
So thank you, Andrew, for that. And then Tom Longbotham asked a very interesting question about the line item veto. If you remember, I think President Reagan was a huge proponent of the line item veto. He'd always say, "Give me the line item veto," and I don't think he ever got it. But Tom Longbotham was asking if the current Doge effort is sort of a way around the line item veto, and then also with the rescission actions that went on. What do you
Sure,
think
yeah,
about
no, the Doge kind of reassessment of where government spending is, I think is really interesting. That's actually really perceptive to see that it's kind of a backdoor way of getting at the budgetary concerns. It'll be interesting to see if Congress can weigh in and do those types of things that the Doge folks have recommended. It's kind of waned. We were very enthusiastic about Doge as a country early on, and that has kind of waned in both parties as of late, and so it'll be interesting to see, where that comes out. But that's a great catch. That's a good catch.
Yeah, thank you to Tom. And then Sandy Thatcher asks, how much does the law require a president to articulate specific reasons for a veto other than just saying, I don't like it?
Yeah, so you're required to send a message, but presidents have varying lengths of messages. And so there's no sort of prescribed method for how long it has to be, other than the fact that they need to send a message for why they opposed it. So when we look back at veto messages, some are relatively short, paragraph, 2 paragraphs. Some are extensive, almost written by the Department of Justice. This section I don't like. Here's why this section matters. And so it really varies, but it would be really helpful to have more. As a scholar, it'd be really helpful to see all of it, but I can't, you know, get everything we want. But
Well, thank you. And we have Emily Cassens, who is one of our former We the Future contest winners. She's a teacher in Denver now.
excellent.
And so, Emily, first of all, hello. And Emily says, this is Emily Cassens, and I teach third grade at Ambleside School of Colorado. I'm not watching with students. School starts later this month, but she did have a question. If a
Sure.
president or governor agrees with a bill in principle, but vetoes it due to a technicality, such as an improper verbiage, how long would the process take for the legislature to rework the bill and get it back through both houses to be signed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we inherently as you guys know, we inherently have a system that's designed to slow and make it very reflective. And I mean, it always depends. It strikes me sometimes Congress is really quick on passing bills, or state legislatures are really quick on passing bills, and other times things get sort of hobbled in a big way. I think if a president is actively communicating with legislative leaders and it's technical fixes, hopefully that would be caught early enough before. And that's why I think the veto threat is so important. Hopefully that would be caught right before final passage, because you never really want to send it all the way back, because then there's ample opportunities for, I was with you on this vote, but you know what? I thought about it a little bit more. I've moved, so the majority might move. But hopefully they're talking a lot, and maybe that can thwart some of that.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
thank you, Emily. Terrence Durbin has a question going back to President Ford and Vietnam. Terrence says, interesting that President Ford was unable to persuade the Congress to fulfill the promise to help South Vietnam when North Vietnam violated the peace treaty in 1975. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really striking. There were a number of efforts by the Ford administration to try and get Congress to come around and support the. There was a supplemental. The amount is escaping me, but he went back to Congress and asked for a supplemental. And the forces on both parties, but predominantly on the Democratic side, Senator Fulbright and others have been very kind of committed to ending our role in Vietnam, and it was pretty much DOA when the supplemental got there. But interestingly, Ford argued heavily for the Operation Baby Lift that brought a lot of South Vietnamese children to America in a lot of ways. And those children of that era are now emerging in our political class in a lot of interesting ways and getting elected to Congress and things. So there's an interesting side to that story where we didn't sustain the military aid, but they did help with some refugee issues in 1970s.
Thank you. And
Yeah,
thank you,
for sure.
Terrence. Uh, Julianne Smith asks, do you happen to know how many bills have been vetoed using the fourth option?
The
Uh,
pocket veto.
right.
Yeah, the pocket
Or-
veto, the number I have, and just to show my work a little bit, the American Presidency Project has a list of everyone's vetoes and their override rates. But pocket vetoes, that fourth option was 1,064 pocket vetoes.
Okay. So those are actually not acting with the Congress being out of session, so the bill is vetoed.
Effectively dead. Yeah,
And
that's
then do
right.
you know how many have been allowed to go into effect, but with the president not signing them, but with the Congress in session?
I wish I had that number. I don't have that number, but yeah, no,
I
maybe
imagine.
I'll email you. I
No,
can maybe
that's,
find
I'm
it.
impressed you have the first one. That's
Yeah, no, it's great.
so around 1,064, you say pocket vetoes.
Yeah, and then regular vetoes was about 1,522.
Oh,
So
really?
it's a little bit, so regular vetoes still has the slight upper hand there, which is interesting. But
Okay. And then Julianne
I
Smith.
just have to say, if there've only been 1,500 vetoes, it seems like FDR did the majority of them.
he did a lot.
I mean, if he did 695 vetoes and we've only had 1,500, is that what you just said?
Yeah, he's got
It
about
looks like
what is that, like
FDR
a
has the
third?
majority of vetoes. Does he not? Am I
Yeah,
correct? Okay, that's
he
interesting.
vetoed a lot. And
I,
it's
I don't know
interesting
how
that,
there are ever that many vetoes when it seems like Congress just passes 1 or 2 bills a year. I find that
well,
fascinating.
yeah, no, it's a strange thing.
Go ahead, Kathy. Sorry.
Well, and this one may have been already answered a little bit, but Julianne also asked if a bill has been vetoed and reasons given, does that spark Congress to go back and rewrite it, addressing the president's reasons for the veto?
Hopefully, right? I think that's the hope. The challenge, guys, is always that the legislature is in flux. So the legislature is constantly always in motion. And so you might have a majority one day in committee, and then somebody didn't have good eggs when they woke up and the majority changes. And so that's kind of the way I think about it. But ideally, you're right. Hopefully they go back with their red line and go back through and make the adjustments. That's the ideal, hopefully.
Well, that's great. Well, we are right at the top of the hour, and
I have a couple of questions.
okay.
Okay, I'm trying to do some math here. Okay, so FDR did like 600 vetoes.
635, yeah.
Okay, so 635 divided by he was in office for not quite 12 years,
Yeah,
right?
like 11.
11. That's 57 vetoes a year,
It's pretty good.
right? Which makes me, but correct me if I'm wrong, it just seems like Congress today only gets 2 or 3 bills a year.
A friend of mine calls it the Rip Van Winkle Congress, right? We have a Congress that's, like you said, more into their socials, more into their, being on TV, and they don't pass laws. And I think the trick to making our Constitution work better is to get Congress back in the game. Pull the legislation, do real legislation, right? Don't delegate your authority out to agencies, do the things, right? And
Oh, that could be a big part of it
yeah,
because
they were
now the
actually,
agencies are just doing a lot of things,
you got
whereas
it,
before
Julie.
Congress did all of it. Fascinating. It
Yeah.
should go back to Congress doing it, as far as I'm concerned,
Yeah,
elected
I think there's
elected
a good
officials.
reason to have the democratic voice represented, and that's a huge part of that
Yeah,
story. Yeah.
interesting, interesting. So it's all the agencies that just do fascinating. They were okay. Before we go though, please hearken back to the Declaration of Independence and where in the Declaration of Independence was the where did
It's
it talk about the fact that they didn't like that encouraged them to in the Constitution do a veto
yeah, it's
process?
that in that section that starts with the grievances against the king,
Yes.
there's one line that says he has refused his assent to laws, and you guys can pull the rest of it
Oh, I
out. But
see. It's pretty quick. It's like number
yeah,
1.
that's right out of the gate. And I always point that out to my students and I say, look, this is where the veto comes from. And there's great stuff where a lot of stuff we knew what was bad government, we didn't want it in ours. And so we fixed
So
that.
in other words, the parliament in or whatever was happening in America, they were passing great laws, whether it was in Great Britain or here, and the king were like, no, don't think so.
Yeah, among them were related to slavery and the slave trade. So there were a lot of that's another story for another day, but there were a lot of colonial legislations where we're trying to end or modify slavery. and the king, for various reasons, wouldn't sign off an assent to them. And so that was part of that scourging.
Oh, really? Well, that's
Yeah, it's kind of
interesting.
wild. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, terrific conversation. Loved it. You're terrific, Professor Hinman. You'll have to come
Thank
back
you.
and join us. It was fabulous. Wyatt, we'll miss you, Wyatt. Come back and visit. And then Tova, what a treat. What always a special blessing to have you with us. And Kathy, terrific as always. Jill and Jorn, top notch. And it was a great show. Thank you all of us for joining us and for sponsoring, and really a terrific educational process. And thank you all.
Thank y'all.